From a collection of unmitigated pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret Total Generalship, Commanding Pre-Modern Armies, Part 3A, Discipline. This is the third-ish part of our three-ish part look at the role of the general in the command of pre-modern armies, particularly in the context of a pitched battle. Last time, we looked at the limits on the ability of the general to communicate his orders to his army. While films and video games often present army command as fairly frictionless, the general can communicate a wide range of orders in the heat of battles, which are easily understood and rapidly acted upon. In actual command, the ability to issue any orders once the battle began was quite limited, leaving a general with a few key decision points rather than a wide open field of possibilities. In this post and the next, since it has become necessary to divide this topic up a bit, we're going to look at the army itself and the degree to which different armies might be differently capable of following the orders a general gives or the plans he makes. In particular, we're going to be talking about the role of three factors: synchronized discipline, independently acting junior officers, and finally, cohesion, in shaping the options available to the general. Originally, I had planned to do those all in one post, but it has become fairly clear they need to be split up. So, each gets its own post. In essence, all three of these factors constrain the degree to which a general can get his army to execute certain plans, particularly complex plans. We'll start with synchronized discipline. And as always, if you like what you are reading here, please share it. If you really like it, you can support me on Patreon. And if you want updates whenever a new post appears, you can click below for email updates or follow me on Twitter @Bret for updates as to new posts, as well as my occasional ancient history, foreign policy, or military history musings. Plug and play armies. For once, synchronized discipline is not a feature of armies entirely absent from historical tactics games. Discipline is often a statistic or feature for more elite units in these games, sometimes as a simple stat boost, often to morale, but in other cases, it really does open up new command options. In many Total War games, disciplined units, the terminology varies, often have access to advanced formations that less well-trained units of a similar type lack. Thus, for instance, in Empire Total War, only the professional line infantry and its elite variants can actually use the fancy fire-by-rank drill once you research it. Less well-trained militia can't. The same is true of more professional units in Total War Three Kingdoms, being able to arrange into various defensive formations that militia units with equivalent arms cannot. But for understandable gameplay reasons, the distinction rarely extends beyond allowing or disallowing certain special abilities on a unit. If I, say, order a unit of professional state troop swordsmen to deploy from column into line by right-click dragging to tell them to adopt a wider formation, they do it instantly and easily, with each man flowing into his new position in the formation. And if I give the same order to a literal peasant mob, they also seemingly effortlessly flow into the new desired width, each man moving mechanically to his new assigned position. But as you may recall, deploying smoothly from column into line was sufficiently tricky to do on the fly that most armies seem to have avoided it in the pre-modern period, instead matching their marching width to their fighting depth, so they could march into position and then left or right face to make the transition easier. The film equivalent to this is the overly complex battle plan, arrived upon by the hero just before the battle, and at best only briefly explained to the army, and always off-screen, so that we can preserve tension. But which the army executes flawlessly in the moment, despite apparently never having trained to do that. Take, for instance, the famous Battle of Stirling scene in Braveheart, 1995, a scene which, I must note, has next to nothing to do with the historical Battle of Stirling Bridge, 1297, including lacking the all-important bridge the battle was fought around. In any case, in the film, Wallace, having apparently invented the pike in the previous scene, deploys them in a large army under combat conditions. And in the words of Todd Howard, quote, "It just works," end quote. Note 1. Trying to do this in real life is more likely to look like the actual launch of Fallout 76 than Todd Howard's imagination of the launch of Fallout 76. End of note 1. Everyone flawlessly knows what to do when he shouts, "Now!" No one panics, no one reacts with confusion, no one fumbles their new and unfamiliar weapons. Note 2. The utterly confused and wild melee that follows is actually also a pretty good example for why armies form in lines and do not fight like they do in the movies, something we'll come to in a moment. End of note 2. No one runs away because they don't trust this newfangled weapon or tactic. Image. Lines of elite troops from Mount and Blade, Bannerlord. Image description. From Mount and Blade, Bannerlord, a version of my budget Turquio formation as performed by elite, highly trained troops with lots of combat experience. The square moves up to block enemy attack, while the loose line of archers can fire around it, while still largely sheltered behind it, while the cavalry wait in reserve to roll out to the flanks and countercharge any flanking cavalry. I use square here because it compresses the infantry the most, allowing the archers clear shots. If the enemy infantry line is intact when it approaches, I deploy the infantry from square into shield wall before countercharging, which in the real world would demand a lot of training. End of image description. Now, in a video game, the reason that soldiers can act in a coordinated way so easily, of course, is that all of those individual modules in a unit of peasant mob are being directed centrally. Note 3. And in a film, they can all do it because it's in the script. End of note 3. Even in a game like Mount and Blade, Bannerlord, where each soldier is simulated separately from any unit, they still snap to formations like this, because the game can both instantly determine exactly where each model should stand and also instantly direct each model to run over and stand at that exact point. You can actually see this very obviously if the commander of an infantry formation is on horseback. Order the formation to move, and the commander will charge forward on their horse and stop at the exact spot they will occupy in when the rest of the formation arrives. But, of course, that demands both information and communication capabilities, which, as we've discussed, no pre-modern army, indeed, no actual army, has. Image. Close-up of the same lines of formation from Mount and Blade, Bannerlord. Image description. The exact same complex formation successfully deployed by an army of barely trained conscripts. It's hard to see, but the core of the square there is almost entirely fresh recruits. Everyone knows where to go, and the whole formation works exactly the same, except that the individual soldiers are less effective with their swords and bows. End of image description. Rather, an army, at its core, is simply a very, very large crowd placed under conditions of extreme psychological stress. Think about the effort that goes into herding crowds to do even very simple things, like filing into and out of a stadium at a sporting event. How much it takes just to get a crowd to walk slowly in one direction through clearly marked doors and routes. So, how do real armies function? And given their limitations, how can they coordinate the action of many hundreds or thousands of humans together? All together now. Pre-modern armies certainly do demand a considerable degree of coordination. In film, and even sometimes in video games, armies clash together in a confused melee, with friends and foes all intermixed at random. Indeed, I have been asked by students more than once, what happens when X type of soldier ends up in a confused melee? And had to explain that the answer is, they don't. Because no one fights that way, at least not intentionally. In a fight, after all, a combatant is extremely vulnerable to attacks from behind or in their peripheral vision, especially if they are focused forward on the foe in front of them. A confused melee would thus produce extreme casualties and produce them extremely quickly. But fighters want to survive their combats, and their leaders would like not only to win the battle, but to have an army at the end of it. Remember, the purpose of the battle is to deliver a siege. If you win the battle, but with only a pathetic handful of survivors, you haven't really won much of anything. The battle line is the obvious solution. Each fighter is only responsible for a few feet of frontage directly in front of them, a small enough area that they can focus on it visually and direct whatever shield or armor or weapons they have towards it, giving them a greater margin of safety, adding depth to the formation, that is increasing the number of ranks, that is a row of fighters right to left. Both secures each fighter against the possibility of being flanked due to the death of the fellows to their right or left, as now they'll just be replaced by the next rank moving up, and adds a morale reinforcement, which we'll come back to in a few weeks. But now, you have a formation that consists essentially of a large number of files, that is, a single row of fighters front to back, which need to move together to create that unbroken, mutually supporting front line, so that no one is being attacked from many sides at once. Again, all of this is before we start adding fighting styles like pike formations or shield walls that are designed to excel in this environment and fare poorly out of it. As an aside, this is one dynamic that I find games like Mount and Blade or the Total War series that simulate individual soldiers struggle to get quite right. In most games, the line of formation either remains almost perfectly rigid, think units on pike phalanx in Rome, Total War, or units the moment they come into contact form rough blobs of models, all pushing forward. But actually, you are going to have men in the rear ranks trying to keep their relative distance to the front ranks, so the formation neither holds rigidly steady nor dissolves, but is going to almost flex and bend, and if you are lucky, not tear or break. This is only an aside though, because we're not well informed about these sorts of dynamics, so it is hard to speak about them in depth. But to fight this way now means that all of your soldiers, really here we are talking about infantry, cavalry must also be coordinated but in different ways. And because they are often composed of elites, that coordination may be produced through different training methods. Need to move in the same direction at the same speed in order to retain that front line, where they can support each other. Again, we're not yet to something like a shield wall or a sarissa phalanx, which demands tight coordination. Even in a rough skirmish line, you need to get everybody moving together just to maintain that unbroken front. A break in the front, after all, would be dangerous. Enemies filtering into it uncontrolled could then flank and defeat individually the members of the broader line. 2-on-1 contests in melee combat typically end in seconds and are very lopsided, causing collapse. Now, the good news is that if all you need an army to do is form up in a rough line, a few ranks deep, and then move more or less forward, the coordination demands are not insurmountable. We've already discussed using marching formations to create the line of battle, so all you need is a way to regulate speed, since forward is a fairly easy direction for everyone. It isn't quite ideal for everyone to simply self-regulate their speed by looking around, at least not for a contact infantry line. For missile skirmish troops moving in a cloud rather than a line, they can absolutely do that, because that will produce a lot of stagger start-stopping and accordioning, which at best will slow you down, and at worst will eventually turn your neat line into a rough crowd, one easily defeated if it is opposed by a line of infantry in good order. Keeping everyone in the same speed can be handled with music. The regular beat regulates the footsteps. That can be a marching song, or it can be an instrument. Ideally, one easy to hear. We've talked about armies, or components of armies, like this. I've described hoplite phalanxes through much of the classical periods, for instance, as essentially unguided missiles for this reason. The general hits go, and the line moves forward. Likewise, a shield wall formation, like the early English fyrd, doesn't need to do complex maneuvers, and for many armies, that was enough. A body of infantry, which either held a position or moved forward in a single line, in some cases with a body of aristocratic cavalry, which might be capable of more complex maneuvers that the aristocrats had trained in since a young age. And you can see, if your culture has armies like this, why the general might be focused on either leading the cavalry in particular, or else being the motivating warrior hero general. Such an army isn't capable of much command once the advance starts in any event. They haven't trained or prepared for it. But what if you need the formation to turn, or change width or depth, or adopt some kind of special formation, like a square or a circle, or, heaven help you, make a feigned retreat, or any other cool general stuff? Now we come to the problems, because even if you can communicate what you want to happen, the problem you have is coordinating hundreds of people doing it. Let's take the really simple example. Company, wheel right. The command here is to take our line, which is wide but not deep. Let's say we're 4 men deep and 25 men wide, and rotate it so that it turns almost like a door with its rightmost soldier as the hinge. But now, things are terribly complicated. At that command, everyone, suddenly, needs to be covering ground at different speeds, even if still stepping in time. The fellow on the far left needs to be moving quite quickly to cover the outer edge of the circle we're drawing with our turn, while the fellow on the extreme right is basically stopped, or in a marching right wheel, advancing at a slower pace. And everyone in the middle needs to keep the same relative position to everyone else as they do it, so the line doesn't fall apart. Image. Diagram of a right wheel maneuver. Image description. The intended movement result of a right wheel command. End of image description. Obviously, doing that quickly in a situation where you are under a lot of psychological pressure is going to take practice. Which brings us to drill and synchronized discipline. The usual solution to this difficulty often goes by the terms drill or discipline, though we should be clear here exactly what we mean. Discipline in particular has a number of meanings. It can mean the personal restraint of an individual, a system of rewards and punishments, and the effects of that system, The punishments are typically corporal. And what we are actually interested in, the ability of a large body of humans to move and act effectively in concert. All of these meanings are present to some degree in the root Latin word disciplina. Note 4. I'm not going to go on at too much length on the importance of disciplina as a key social concept in Roman society, but it was very important. Fortunately, I have already recommended J.E. Linden's Soldiers and Ghosts, 2006, which presents disciplina as one of the two core animating concepts of Roman military values, alongside virtuous. So, you can go read that. End of note 4. For clarity's sake, then, I am going to borrow a term, as is my habit, from W. Lee, Waging War, 2016. Synchronized discipline, to describe the humans moving and acting in concert component of discipline that we're most interested in here. That said, it is worth noting that those three concepts, personal restraint, corporal punishment, and the synchronized component of discipline, are frequently, but not universally, associated for reasons we'll get to. Not merely in the Roman concept of disciplina, but note also, for instance, their close association in Sun Tzu's Art of War in the first chapter, section 13. Image. Ming illustration of a musket drill. Image description. Via Wikipedia, an illustration of a Ming musket drill using volley fire techniques, 1639. Drill and synchronized discipline were not purely a phenomenon of Europe or the broader Mediterranean. End of image description. The reason we cannot just call this drill is because while drill is the most common way agrarian societies produce this result, it is not the only way to this end. For instance, as we've discussed before, steppe nomads could achieve a very high degree of coordination and synchronization without the same formal systems of drill, because the training that produced that coordination was embedded in their culture, particularly in hunting methods. And so, young steppe nomad males were acculturated into the synchronicity that way. Note 5. For more on this, see T. May, The Mongol Art of War, 2007. End of note 5. That said, for the rest of this, we're going to place those systems aside and mostly focus on synchronized discipline as a result of drill, because for most armies that developed a great deal of synchronized discipline, that's how they did it. Fundamentally, the principle behind using drill to build synchronized discipline is that the way to get a whole lot of humans to act effectively in concert together is to force them to practice doing exactly the things they'll be asked to do on the battlefield a lot, until the motions are practically second nature. Indeed, the ideal in developing this kind of drill was often to ingrain the actions the soldiers were to perform so deeply that in the midst of the terror of battle, when they couldn't even really think straight, those soldiers would fall back on simply, mechanically performing the actions they were trained to perform. That, in turn, creates an important element of predictability. An individual soldier does not need to be checking their action or position against the others around them as much, because they've done this very maneuver with these very fellows, and so already know where everyone is going to be. Image. Illustration of mustered troops from Les Grands Miseres. Image description. Via Wikipedia, Plate 2 of Les Grands Miseres de la Guerre, by Jacques Collot, 1592 to 1635, showing scenes of the misery of the 30 Years' War. Here, troops are enrolled and mustered. Things go downhill from here. End of image description. The context that drill tends to emerge in, this is an idea invented more than once, tends to give it a highly regimented, fairly brutal character. For instance, in early modern Europe, the structure of drill for gunpowder armies was conditioned by elite snobbery. European officer aristocrats, in many cases the direct continuation of the medieval aristocracy, had an extremely poor view of their common soldiers, drawn from the peasantry. Assuming they lacked any natural valor, harsh drill was settled upon as a solution to make the actions of battle merely mechanical, to reduce the man to a machine. Roman commanders seem to have thought somewhat better of their soldiers' bravery, but assumed that harsh discipline was necessary to control, restrain, and direct the native, fiery virtus, strength, bravery, valor of the common soldier, who, unlike the aristocrat, could not be expected to control himself. Again, in the snobbish view of the aristocrats. Image. Illustration from Les Grands Misérables, showing corporal punishments. Image description. Via Wikipedia. Plate 10 of Les Grands Misérables de la Guerre by Jacques Collot, 1592 to 1635. Showing the punishment of soldiers via l'estrapade, or the strappado, a form of torture where the victim is suspended by their wrists, dislocating the shoulders. End of image description. In short, drills tend to appear in highly stratified agrarian societies, the very nature of which tends to mean that drill is instituted by a class of aristocrats who have at best a dim view of their common soldiers. Consequently, while the core of drill is to simply practice the actions of battle over and over again until they become natural, drill tends to also be encrusted with lots of corporal punishments and intense regulation as a product of those elite attitudes. And though it falls outside of our topic today, it seems worth noting that our systems of drill to produce synchronized discipline have the same roots, deriving from early modern musket drill. Nevertheless, a thoroughly drilled army becomes capable of a lot more. To get a sense of how much more, I think we ought to take an example. The limits of the possible with synchronized discipline. Of course, I choose the Romans. Could there have ever been any doubt? Image. Relief of mailed Roman legionaries. Image description. Via Wikipedia. A small relief from Glanum showing mailed Roman legionaries in fighting formation. End of image description. But, in all seriousness, to say the Romans had a reputation for this sort of thing is honestly underselling the point. Polybius remarks both on the superior flexibility of Roman soldiers, Book 18, Chapter 31, Sections 9 to 11, and the intensity and effectiveness of Roman rewards and punishments, Book 6, Chapters 35 to 38. Josephus, a Greek-speaking Jewish man from the province of Judea who first rebelled against the Romans and then switched sides, offers the most famous endorsement of Roman drills. Quote, "Nor would one be mistaken to say that their drills are bloodless battles, and their battles bloody drills." End quote. The Jewish War, Book 3, Chapter 5, Section 1. It is hard to tell if the Roman triple line, triplex achis, fighting system, note 6, which, like everything in the Roman army, is a slight miscount. There are 4 lines in the triplex achis of the Middle Republic, because the velites skirmish out in front. They're not included in the number because the triplex refers to the lines of heavy infantry. End of note 6. Created the demand for synchronized discipline, or if the Romans, having already developed a tradition of drill and synchronized discipline, adopted a fighting style that leveraged that advantage. Probably a bit of both, but in any event, our evidence for the Roman army before the very late 3rd century is very poor. By the time we truly see the Roman army clearly, circa 225 BC, the system seems to already be in place for some time. A Roman consular army was a complex machine, note 7. I'm going to focus on the Middle Republic here, but a lot of this continues, and some of it even intensifies into the late Republic and the early Empire. End of note 7. It was composed of an infantry line of 2 legions in the center and 2 socii wings, aili, to each side, along with cavalry detachments covering the flanks. Each of those infantry blocks, 2 legions, 2 aili, in turn was broken down into 30 separate maneuvering units, called maniples, generally consisting of 120 men, half as many for the triarii, note 8. Note that we are assuming the organization of the socii broadly matched the Romans, which it seems to have done in general features, though we are often not well informed on particulars. End of note 8. Which were in turn subdivided into centuries, but centuries didn't really maneuver independently. In front of this was a light infantry screening force, the velites. So, notionally, there were in the heavy infantry of a standard 2-legion consular army something like 120 different chess pieces that notionally the general could move around on their own, and thus, notionally, the legion was capable of fairly complex tactical maneuvers. Image. Diagram of the manipular legion in battle formation. Image description. Diagram of the battle formation of a Roman legion. Remember, legions did not generally fight alone. In a standard consular army, there would be 2 legions, side by side, with 2 allied alii on the right and left of that, and then the Roman and allied cavalry to the right and left of that. End of image description. You may have noted that word, notionally, because now we get into the limits of drill and synchronized discipline. Because this isn't a system for limitless tactical flexibility of the sort one gets in video games. Instead, recall that the idea here is to create coordinated movement and fighting, the synchronized discipline, through rigorous, repeated practice, drill. Of course, one needs to practice specific things. Some of those things are going to be obvious. A drill for marching forward, or for turning the unit, or for advancing on the charge. In the Roman case, a standard battle involved the successive engagement and potentially retreat of each heavy infantry line. First, the hastati, the first line, formed a solid line, filling the gaps, and attacked, and then, if unsuccessful, retreated, and the next line, the principes, would try, and so on. Those maneuvers would need to be practiced, forming up, then having each maniple close the gap. We don't quite know how they did this, but see below. The attack itself, which also involved usually throwing pila, heavy javelins, then retreat behind the next line if things went poorly. It's also pretty clear from a battle like Kynokephali, 197, or Bibracte, 58, that individual maniples or cohorts, the Romans start using the larger 480-man cohort as the basic maneuver unit during the 2nd century BC, could be driven over the battlefield to a degree, so there were probably drills for wheeling and turning. Now, even in this standard battle, there is a lot of movement. Maniples need to open and close gaps, advance and retreat, and so on. This is what I mean by saying this army is a complex machine. It has a lot of moving parts that need to move together. The men in a manipole need to move together to make that mutually supporting line, and the maniples need to move together with each other to cover flanks and allow retreats. In terms of how the individual men moved, I've tended to think in terms of a flow model, akin to this video of South Korean riot police training, rather than the clunkier Spartacus 1960 model. But once an army has practiced all of these drills, it creates the opportunity for greater improvisation and more complex tactics as well. Commanders, both the general but also his subordinates, can tell a unit to perform a particular maneuver that they have drilled, assuming the communication infrastructure exists in terms of instruments, standard shouted commands, and battle standards. And note back to last week, on how Roman methods of battlefield communication were relatively well developed. That, for instance, allowed Aemilius Paulus to give orders to his first legion at Pydna for each of those maneuver units to either push forward or give ground independently, presenting the Macedonian phalanx with a tactical problem, an unevenly resisting line it did not have a good solution for. Plutarch, Life of Aemilius, chapter 20, sections 8 to 10. Having good junior officers, next week's topic, was required, but it wasn't enough. Those officers needed units which were already sufficiently drilled so that their orders, to press hard or retreat and reform in this case, could actually be carried out by soldiers for whom the response to those calls had become natural through that very drill. At the same time, I don't want to give the wrong impression. Even for the Romans, battles where there was this sort of on-the-field improvising led by the general were uncommon, though not extremely rare. For the majority of battles, the legionary machine simply pushed forward in its standard way, even when, as at Cannae 216, pushing forward normally proved to be disastrous. Just because an army can fight flexibly doesn't mean it will, or even that it should. Orders by the menu. But the real reason I wanted to run through the Roman system for doing this is actually to demonstrate the limits of this kind of synchronized discipline. Because yes, this sort of drill and training allowed constituent units to potentially maneuver more dynamically and flexibly when under competent leadership. It is quite striking that Roman command skill with this sort of thing was very dependent on the skill of the general, and one assumes by proxy the skill of his subordinate officers. More on that next week. But only to do those things which they had practiced. And therein lies the rub. Just as the commander doesn't have a multitude of points where he can intervene in the battle, but rather a limited set of key decision points, so too, he does not have an infinite set of potential orders he or his subordinates might give at any given moment. Instead, the commander or his subordinates has a McDonald's menu worth of options he can employ. He can order anything on the menu and expect the unit to respond accordingly, but he cannot order anything not on the menu. Nor can he order an altered version of a menu item. No Big Mac without cheese, sir. This is not a Wendy's. Now, generals could, and did, use drilling in the early stages of the campaign to add one or two menu items to their drill, so as to be prepared for this or that problem. Indeed, the general preparing some sort of surprise of this sort and then deploying it against an enemy is a standard topos of effective ancient generalship. Although, in many cases, we may doubt the purported gimmick was actually used. For example, Dionysius, Book 20, Chapter 1, Section 6. Dio, Book 10, Chapter 5. But that is the thing. Such extra menu items have to be prepared in advance, and often well in advance of the battle. Caesar, for instance, anticipating war elephants, drills his troops in anti-war elephant tactics before the Battle of Thapsus, 46 BC. Caesar, African War, Book 84. Alexander's phalanx seems to have been drilled to respond to scythed chariots as well, Arrian, Anabasis, Book 3, Chapter 13, Sections 5 to 6. That said, the bulk of the menu was likely to remain constant. After all, these menu items, while they have simple names, are often actually fairly complex to do and train when you are dealing with units of dozens or hundreds. Turning back to our example of company right wheel, we can get a sense of the complexity of training that maneuver by the way they did it. The right guide, the man on the extreme right, adopts a set pace, 9-inch steps, while the left guide moves at the normal regulated speed. Note this requires training your soldiers not only to step in time, but to step at standard lengths. And every soldier in the middle regulates his motion by maintaining elbow contact with the man to his side. That's a good method to get the result, but it isn't an obvious or simple method. The fellow training the company to do this needs to already know how to do this. Now, in the modern period, with mass printing, you could print drill manuals that had all of the commands and instructions on how to do them. But in the pre-modern period, that kind of mass printing isn't an option, and our military techs almost never go into this kind of granular detail. So, your officers have to learn to train the behavior by observing it and participating in it themselves, which means in turn a great deal of your package is set before the Army is even mustered at the beginning of the campaign season, because you are relying on a package of culturally embedded knowledge about how armies ought to function. And if your culture doesn't have that tradition, inventing it from scratch is going to be hard and take time. And by time, I mean decades. Effective drill for volley fire, the countermarch, for instance, answered a need that had existed for most of the 16th century. But the embryonic ideas for it only started emerging in the 1570s. The actionable plan on how to do it in 1594, and it was only then finally deployed in a major battle in 1600 at Newport. However, the time available for that kind of training is limited. Remember that drill works by repeating the same set of actions over and over again until they become almost instinctive. That takes a lot of time and repetition. That both means it is going to be difficult to find space for new menu items, especially with green troops that still need to learn the basics. But also that synchronized discipline itself is expensive. Our ancient sources stress how Roman levels of synchronized discipline required diligent and continuous drilling to create and maintain. Doing that, in turn, would demand keeping the soldiers in question under arms for training for long periods when they are not fighting. In the Middle Republic, this seems to have been accomplished through rolling recruitment. Rome was essentially always at war and always raising armies, so there were always a goodly number of veterans to train and break in the truly green new recruits in any given draft. Though, again, and I owed this notion to Michael Taylor, there are some signs that the less intense conflict of the mid-2nd century leads to some dulling of the Roman edge. As we transition through the late Republic into the early Empire, that is replaced by the slow professionalization of the Roman army, culminating in the force of long-service professionals created by Augustus. Being mobilized in peacetime, professional soldiers could be drilled extensively, assuming their cultural values are going to let them drill you. Also, be wary here of assuming standing forces of military settlers are professional in this way. But all of that is extraordinarily expensive. Keeping those soldiers under arms, after all, means that they need to be fed, clothed, and paid. Even in a system like the Middle Roman Republic, where soldiers provided their own kit out of their own wealth, because Roman soldiers in the Middle Republic were recruited from the modestly well-to-do small holding class. By drafting those men, you have removed them from that economic activity. The expense of doing this would have been, in most cases, enormous. And of course, those are resources that could be deployed to any number of other uses, including simply raising a larger army of less disciplined, well-trained troops. For, say, a Greek polis, given the choice between having 450 men under arms all year round and excellently trained, or having 5,000 hoplites under arms only in the 1 month where there is a battle to fight, the clear answer is the latter. A lot of things need to line up before producing armies with high levels of synchronized discipline makes sense. The state needs a lot of resources, year-round security challenges, and a tactical system which is effective and demands this kind of investment. So, while developing synchronized discipline offered an army a degree of greater control and flexibility, it was prohibitively expensive. Conclusion, Part 3a. It isn't hard to understand, given those costs, why most pre-modern armies didn't invest this heavily in synchronized discipline or drill, especially if their infantry was expected merely to be a pinning or holding force, and for aristocratic cavalry to be the battle-winning force. By and large, armies capable of the kind of synchronized discipline of a Roman or Han dynasty, or early modern gunpowder army, were the exception rather than the rule. Yet in games, the player is never really given this choice or forced to make this trade-off between more expensive armies which allow for greater control and cheaper armies which can only be handled in very limited ways. Even if cheap units can't adopt advanced formations, and they often can, they can still maneuver around the battlefield with as much agility as far more highly trained units. It is infrequent, for instance, to have units which can be perhaps trusted to hold their ground, but which cannot really be ordered to attack. We'll come back to the absurdity of being able to order a peasant mob to charge elite units, and having them do it in a bit, which was a fairly common concern of pre-modern commanders. Note 9. I always really liked that in the old Sierra Civil War Generals games, unit cohesion would first prevent the unit from charging, then from attacking in general long before the unit broke and fled, so that weak, low morale units could defend, but it was unwise to order them to attack, and some units simply lacked the cohesion to charge even without having taken losses. Really wish those games would get a remaster and re-release. They were quite good. End of note 9. Now, I should note that, so far, we've mostly talked about drill's role in producing synchronized discipline, but this is also a way of producing cohesion as well. The process, often quite brutal, of inculcating synchronized discipline produces cohesion through the shared experience and shared suffering of the troops. It is essentially a tool for creating synthetic cohesion, particularly useful if an army has no organic cohesive elements. Cohesion, of course, has its own effects on the ability of an army to execute complex plans. Next week, we'll turn and look at another key element in enabling even this limited degree of tactical flexibility: junior officers. Because it doesn't matter how well drilled the army is, if there is no command structure to communicate orders from the general to his troops, those orders will not be acted upon. This has been a recording from a collection of unmitigated pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret Devereaux, recorded by myself, A Great Divorce, for accessibility and sharing purposes. If you enjoyed this content and wish to engage with it or support Bret, please check the description for links to the original post on his blog, his Twitter, and his Patreon. I highly encourage you to share, support, and engage with his works on any and all platforms if you are so inclined. If you wish to support me, please do remember to like, share, and subscribe to this or any other content here that you enjoy. Thank you so much for listening.